The first thing I remember is her voice, shaking, desperate, barely louder than the hum of fluorescent lights about to shut off at night. "Could you give me a ride home? Please." She stood there by the elevator, like someone whose world had just collapsed. I should have said yes immediately. I should have grabbed my keys without thinking twice. But instead, the only thing that slipped out was the one question that changed everything. "Sure, but is there a bed for two?" And if I had known what that night would lead to, what walls it would tear down, what secrets it would expose, what lives it would rebuild, I might have chosen my words differently. Or maybe I wouldn't have. Because sometimes the path you never planned to walk becomes the one you can't imagine living without. But this story begins long before that office mixer, long before her voice cracked in desperation. It begins with a 2-hour bus ride, a cramped house on the outskirts, and a daughter who thought her daddy lived far away because he was important, not because he was barely holding on. Let me tell you about the kind of poverty that hides in plain sight, the kind that wears a suit and carries a briefcase and smiles politely at office mixers while internally calculating bus schedules down to the minute. For 8 months, I had been living with my mother and my 4-year-old daughter Emily in a cramped 2-bedroom rental on the outskirts of the city. Every morning, I woke up at 5 a.m. to catch the first bus downtown. Every evening, I raced to catch the last bus back at 10:15 p.m. Missed that bus, and I was stranded. There were no backup options, no emergency funds for hotels, no friends with couches nearby. The 10:15 bus wasn't just transportation. It was a thin thread holding my entire life together. My co-workers at Grandstone Financial didn't know any of this. They assumed I lived somewhere reasonable, somewhere that matched the press shirts and the competent reports I delivered in meetings. They didn't know that I rotated between 2 suits, that I skipped lunch most days, that my daughter thought I lived far away because I was important at work, not because I couldn't afford anything closer. The office mixer that Thursday night was running late, the way these things always did. By 10 p.m., I was already anxious. By 10:07 p.m., I was heading for the door, mentally mapping the 3-block sprint to the terminal, when Lori Chin stopped me. Lori was a senior executive, someone I'd only ever spoken to in formal meetings, someone who seemed to exist in an entirely different universe than mine. She was terrified that night, her usual composure completely shattered, and she asked me for a ride home. She said her car wouldn't start, and she couldn't wait for roadside assistance. I had 8 minutes to catch my bus. 8 minutes to get home to my daughter. 8 minutes before my carefully balanced life collapsed. But I agreed to help her, and then I asked a question that must have sounded completely inappropriate. "Is there a bed for two?" She recoiled immediately, thinking I was trying to take advantage of her desperation. I had to explain quickly. I didn't own a car, I took the bus, and if I drove her home, I'd be stranded downtown for the night with nowhere to go. I needed a place to sleep, nothing more. The moment I said those words, I'd exposed myself completely. I'd told a senior executive that I was poor, that I was barely holding on, that my professional persona was essentially a performance hiding desperate circumstances. She processed this information in seconds, her expression shifting from suspicion to something like recognition. Then she told me she had a guest room, and she'd drive me back in the morning. But we had to leave immediately. That's when I noticed what had really scared her. Her ex-husband was waiting in the parking lot in his car, watching her. This wasn't about a broken-down vehicle at all. This was about a woman being stalked, being hunted, by someone who was supposed to have loved her. I thought about my daughter asleep at my mother's house. I thought about the bus that would leave without me in exactly 4 minutes. I thought about how I was about to spend a night in a stranger's guest room, in a part of the city I'd never been to, trusting that she'd really drive me back in the morning. And I thought about how sometimes you help people not because it's convenient, but because they're asking you to be human in a moment when they need it most. We got into her car and drove away from the office, away from the terminal, away from everything familiar. Her ex-husband's car followed us for the first 10 minutes before she lost him on the highway. The drive to Riverside Heights took 40 minutes, and during that time, two strangers became something else. Two people who'd been pretending everything was fine while their lives quietly fell apart. Lori drove fast, constantly checking her mirrors, her hands tight on the wheel. She apologized 3 times for putting me in this situation, for making me miss my bus, for disrupting my life. Each time, I told her it was fine, even though we both knew it wasn't really fine for either of us. About 15 minutes into the drive, after she was certain her ex-husband wasn't following us anymore, she finally asked me about the bus. She wanted to know how long I'd been doing this. The 4-hour daily commute, the life on the outskirts, the whole exhausting routine. I told her everything, not because I wanted sympathy, but because the secret had been weighing on me for so long that it felt like a relief to finally say out loud. I told her about my divorce 2 years ago, about losing the apartment in the settlement, about moving in with my mother temporarily while I got back on my feet. I told her about Emily, about how she was too young to understand why Daddy didn't live with her all the time, about how I called her every night before she went to sleep, even though I was usually still on the bus. I told her about the mathematics of survival, how I calculated exactly how much I needed to save for a security deposit on a new apartment, how that number kept growing as rent increased, how I was essentially running on a treadmill that kept speeding up while I stayed in the same place. Lori listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she told me her story. She'd been married to Daniel for 7 years. He was a corporate lawyer, successful and charming, the kind of man who looked perfect on paper. But behind closed doors, he was controlling. He monitored her phone, questioned her about her colleagues, accused her of affairs that weren't happening. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, but he hadn't accepted it. He showed up at her office building, at restaurants where she had dinner meetings, at the gym where she worked out. He sent hundreds of texts that oscillated between apologetic and threatening. She filed for a restraining order, but he was careful never to quite cross the line into something prosecutors would act on. He was always just watching, just checking in, just happening to be in the same place at the same time. And she'd become a prisoner in her own life, afraid to go anywhere alone, afraid to stay anywhere too long. Her house in Riverside Heights was enormous and empty. After the divorce, she'd gotten a house in the settlement, but it felt like a museum now, beautiful and cold and full of rooms she never used. She had money. She had success. She had everything that was supposed to make a person feel secure, but she was terrified every single day. As we talked, something strange happened. The distance between us, the class difference, the professional hierarchy, all the things that should have made us incompatible as friends, dissolved completely. We were just two people who'd been lying to everyone around us, pretending we had our lives together while privately drowning. I'd been pretending I wasn't poor. She'd been pretending she wasn't afraid. And for one night, in the enclosed space of her car, driving through the dark city, we stopped pretending. She asked me if I was ashamed of my situation, and I told her the truth. Yes, constantly. Every day at work felt like an act, like I was one slip comment away from being exposed as a fraud who didn't belong in those meetings or that building. I asked her if she'd told anyone at work about her ex-husband, and she said no. She was afraid it would make her seem weak, afraid it would undermine her authority, afraid that people would start questioning her judgment if they knew she'd married someone like Daniel. We were both carrying secrets that were crushing us, both terrified of being seen as we really were. By the time we pulled into her driveway in Riverside Heights, it was almost 11 p.m. The neighborhood was exactly what I'd imagined. Gates and security codes, houses set far back from the street, the kind of silence that only exists in places where people have enough money to buy distance from the world. Her house was beautiful in a way that felt intimidating. Large windows, a manicured lawn, a 3-car garage. This was the kind of place I'd driven past hundreds of times without ever imagining I'd be inside one. But as we walked the front door, Lori suddenly grabbed my arm. Her ex-husband's car was parked across the street, headlights off, engine running. He'd found her. He'd followed us somehow, or maybe he'd known where she'd go and had just waited. Either way, he was here, watching, making sure she knew that nowhere was safe. Listen, if you've made it this far in the story, you're invested. You want to know what happens to them. But here's the thing. Most people scroll past these stories without subscribing. They watch, they enjoy, and they disappear. If this story matters to you, if you actually care how it ends, hit that subscribe button, please. It takes 2 seconds. And if you don't, you'll probably forget about this channel and never another amazing stories from me. Inside Lori's house, the fear became something tangible. She checked every door, every window, making sure everything was locked. She turned on the security system and pulled the curtains closed. And then she sat down on her couch and told me she couldn't remember the last time she felt safe in her own home. I told her I'd stay awake on the couch, that I'd keep watch, that if anything happened I'd call the police immediately. She protested at first. I was her guest. I needed sleep. I had work tomorrow. But I could see the relief in her eyes at the suggestion. She didn't want to be alone that night. Didn't want to lie awake in her bedroom wondering if her ex-husband was still outside or if he'd found a way in. She showed me to the living room, brought me a blanket and a pillow, and then hesitated at the hallway entrance. She thanked me again, and this time there was something different in her voice. Not just gratitude, but a kind of wonder, like she couldn't quite believe that a near stranger had agreed to spend a night protecting her. I told her it was the least I could do, considering she'd saved me from sleeping on the streets. That made her laugh, a small, tired sound that seemed to surprise both of us. After she went to her bedroom, I stayed on the couch with the lights off, watching the street through a gap in the curtains. Her ex-husband's car stayed there for another hour before finally driving away. But I didn't trust that he was really gone, so I kept watching. Around 2 a.m., Lori came back downstairs. She couldn't sleep, she said, and she'd noticed a light from the street, still showing through the curtains, which meant I was still awake too. She asked if I was hungry. We ended up in her kitchen, which was the kind of kitchen you see in home design magazines, marble countertops, professional-grade appliances, a refrigerator that probably cost more than 3 months of my salary. She heated up soup while I sat at her kitchen island, and we talked about everything except the reasons we were both awake at 2 a.m. She told me about growing up in California, about her parents who'd immigrated from Taiwan with almost nothing, about how she'd built her career through sheer determination and 80-hour work weeks. I told her about Emily's favorite bedtime stories, about how my mother had raised me alone after my father left, about how I'd always thought I'd be a better father than mine had been, only to find myself repeating some of the same patterns, absent, struggling, unable to provide the stability a child deserved. The soup was simple, just chicken broth and vegetables, but it felt like the most important meal I'd had in months. Not because I was hungry, though I was, but because there was something profound about sitting in a stranger's kitchen at 2 a.m, sharing food and stories, and the kind of honesty that only comes when you're too tired to maintain pretenses. Lori told me she'd been thinking about what I'd said in the car, about the mathematics of survival, about how I was trying to save for an apartment while expenses kept rising. She said she'd been doing her own mathematics for months, calculating how much money she had versus how much safety could buy her, how large her house was versus how empty it felt, how successful she looked to everyone else versus how trapped she felt in her own life. She said something then that I'll never forget. We're both homeless. Paul, you don't have a home because you can't afford one. I don't have a home because mine doesn't feel safe. Maybe that's the same thing. We talked until almost 4 a.m., and then we were both too exhausted to keep our eyes open. She went back to her bedroom, and I stretched out on the couch, finally allowing myself to sleep. But before I drifted off, I heard her voice in the hallway. Thank you for staying. I haven't felt this safe in my own house in months. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just told her good night. But I understood what she meant. Sometimes safety isn't about locks or security systems or restraining orders. Sometimes it's just about knowing someone else is there, that you're not facing your fears alone. Morning came too quickly. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee brewing. Lori was already up, dressed for work, looking composed again in a way that made the previous night feel almost dreamlike. She made breakfast, real breakfast, eggs and toast and fruit, and we ate quickly, both aware that I needed to get back to the outskirts of my daughter and she needed to get to work. But as we were cleaning up, she asked me something unexpected. She wanted to see where I lived. She wanted to meet my daughter and my mother. She wanted to understand the life I'd been describing, not as an abstraction, but as a real place with real people. I hesitated. The outskirts weren't pretty. My mother's house wasn't impressive. Everything about my life, there was a reminder of failure, of how far I'd fallen, of how much I didn't have. Bringing Lori there felt like exposing a wound I'd been trying to keep covered. But she insisted. She said after everything I'd seen about her life, her fear, her empty house, her stalker ex-husband, it was only fair that she see mine. So we drove. She followed me through parts of the city that probably made her uncomfortable, past neighborhoods that got progressively rougher, past the invisible boundary where the city's investment stopped and its neglect began. The drive that took me 2 hours on the bus took 40 minutes in her car, and I could see her processing that mathematics, that I spent 4 hours a day in transit, 8 hours a day at work, leaving almost no time for anything else. My mother's house sat at the end of a street where half the streetlights were broken. The lawn needed mowing. The paint was peeling. The house next door had bars on the windows. This was the reality I'd been hiding from everyone at work. The truth behind the pressed suit and the confident emails. When we pulled up, my mother was on the porch with Emily. They'd been worried. I'd called late the night before to say I'd missed my bus and would explain everything in the morning, but I could hear the concern in my mother's voice even over the phone. Emily ran to me the moment I got out of the car. She was 4 years old, all energy and questions, and complete trust that Daddy would always come back. She didn't know how precarious everything was, didn't understand that we were one missed paycheck away from losing even this small, cramped place. I introduced Lori to my mother and my daughter, watching these two parts of my life collide in a way I'd never anticipated. My mother was gracious but wary. She recognized expensive when she saw it, and she was protective of Emily and me. Lori was gentle with Emily, kneeling down to her level and asking about the stuffed rabbit she was clutching. My mother invited Lori inside for tea, and I could see her taking in everything. The worn furniture, the small rooms, the way 3 people's lives were compressed into a space that should have held one. But she didn't look judgmental. She looked sad and maybe a little angry, though I wasn't sure at whom. While my mother and Lori talked in the kitchen, I took Emily to her room to help her find her shoes. She asked me why I didn't come home the night before, and I told her I'd help a friend who needed me. She asked if Lori was my friend, and I realized I didn't know how to answer that. We'd known each other for less than 12 hours, but those 12 hours had contained more truth than some friendships hold in years. When I came back to the kitchen, I heard the tail end of a conversation between my mother and Lori. My mother was explaining how hard I worked, how I never complained, how I called Emily every single night no matter how late or how tired. And Lori was listening with an intensity that made me think she was understanding something important. Then Lori did something I didn't expect. She made an offer. She told my mother about the house in Riverside Heights, about how it had 4 bedrooms she never used, about how it felt empty and unsafe at the same time. She told her about the ex-husband who watched her from his car, about how she felt safer last night with a stranger on her couch than she had in months alone in that big house. And then she proposed something that sounded impossible. What if we stayed there, not as charity? She clarified quickly, but as an arrangement that helped both of us. I'd have a place closer to work, eliminating the brutal commute. Emily would have her own room. My mother would have her own space. And Lori would have people in the house. Would never be alone when her ex-husband showed up uninvited. She'd still charge rent, she insisted, below market rate, but enough that it wouldn't feel like charity. And we'd all have our own lives, our own spaces, but we'd also have each other when we needed support. My mother looked at me, waiting for my reaction. Emily was tugging on my hand, asking if we were going to live in a big house. And I was trying to process this offer that seemed too good to be real, trying to figure out what the catch was, trying to understand why this woman I barely knew would do something this generous. Lori explained her reasoning calmly, the way she probably explained business proposals in board meetings. It made financial sense. Her mortgage was paid off, and she had multiple empty bedrooms generating no value. It made practical sense. She needed people around for safety, and we needed housing closer to work. And it made emotional sense, though she said this part more quietly. After last night, she understood something about being trapped, about pretending everything was fine when it wasn't, about needing help but being too proud or too afraid to ask for it. She said she'd been thinking all morning about what I'd said about Emily, about how she thought I lived far away because I was important at work. She said no child should have to make excuses for their parents' absence, and no parent should have to choose between keeping their job and being present for their child. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to refuse immediately, to insist that we didn't need help, that we'd figure things out on our own. That was the pride talking, the same pride that kept me suffering on that 2-hour bus commute for 8 months rather than asking anyone for help. But another part of me, the part that was tired of pretending, tired of struggling, tired of watching my daughter grow up in rooms that were too small while I was too absent, that part wanted to say yes immediately. My mother made the decision for me. She looked at Lori and asked practical questions. When could we move in? How would we split utilities? What were the house rules? How would we handle disagreements? She was approaching this like a business transaction, protecting our dignity while also recognizing an opportunity when she saw one. Lori answered every question directly and honestly. She had a lawyer who could draw up a proper rental agreement. She'd want first and last month's rent, but she'd waive the security deposit. Everyone would have their own space, their own keys, their own privacy. The only expectation was that someone would be home most evenings. For her safety, she admitted, though she tried to frame it as a mutual benefit. Emily asked if she could have her own room, and when Lori said yes, the decision was essentially made. How could I say no to my daughter having her own space, to cutting 8 hours of commuting out of my life, to living somewhere safe and stable even if it meant accepting help I'd been too proud to ask for? We agreed to think about it for 24 hours, but we all knew what the answer would be. On the drive back to my mother's house, after Lori had left, my mother told me something I needed to hear. Accepting help isn't the same as giving up, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you can't do everything alone. 3 weeks later, we moved into Lori's house in Riverside Heights. Emily got her own room with windows that overlooked a garden. My mother got a space where she could finally spread out after years of cramped living. I got a 10-minute commute to work instead of 4 hours a day on the bus. And Lori got something she'd been missing for months, a house that felt like a home, filled with people and noise and life. Her ex-husband showed up twice in the first month, but both times I was there, and both times he left without incident. The restraining order she'd filed months ago finally got approved after her lawyer submitted evidence of the continued harassment. Daniel eventually stopped coming around. The arrangement worked because it benefited everyone. I paid rent that was affordable but fair. My mother helped with cooking and kept the house running smoothly. Emily filled the empty spaces with the kind of joy that only 4-year-olds can generate. And Lori stopped being afraid in her own home. People at work eventually figured out that Lori and I carpooled, though they assumed we'd become friends rather than understanding the more complex truth. We'd saved each other. She'd given me housing and proximity to my job. I'd given her safety and the family presence she'd been missing. But more than any practical benefit, we'd given each other permission to stop pretending. I stopped hiding my struggles from colleagues who might have helped if they'd known. She stopped hiding her fear from friends who could have supported her. We both learned that the thing we'd been most ashamed of, needing help, was actually the most human thing about us. Looking back, I think about that question I asked her in the office. Is there a bed for two? I meant it literally at the time, a practical question about whether I'd have a place to sleep, but it became something larger, a question about whether two people could share space, share burdens, share the weight of their individual struggles in a way that made both lighter? The answer, it turned out, was yes. There was a bed for two. There was room for a struggling single father, for a terrified executive, for a grandmother who'd been helping raise her son's daughter in two small spaces, for a little girl who deserved her own room. There was room for all of us in a house that had been too empty and in lives that had been too full pretending. Sometimes the question you ask in desperation becomes the answer you didn't know you needed. And sometimes asking for help, whether to ride home or a place to sleep, or just someone to sit with you at 2 a.m. while the world feels dangerous, is the bravest thing you can do. That's what I learned the night Lori asked me for a ride home, and I asked her for a bed for two. We were both homeless in different ways, both pretending to be fine, both terrified of being seen as we really were. And in helping each other, we both finally found our way home. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will listen to this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. Kindly support what I do here by subscribing, and then also drop in the comment section if you would like part 2.